Welcome to the Future of Sharing, this series where we're really looking hard at how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone and work for everyone in the long term. I'm Pete Light. I'm the founder of Reinvent. I drive the series and also the series of interviews here. And today we've got a special guest. We've got Richard Florida. Now, Richard has been basically for about 15 years, it's been 15 years now, when his really seminal book came out on the rise of the creative class. And he kind of was very much ahead of the game of how people were moving back to the cities. The economy was recentering in the cores of the cities rather than moving away from the cities. And he really had a lot of insights way ahead of the game and has spent the last 15 years kind of traveling the world explaining a lot of that and the evolution of those ideas. But he also is extremely intellectually honest, and he's also got a ton of integrity. And as the facts started shifting or moving and the kind of theory started evolving a little bit, he really started getting much more interested recently in the inequalities in these cities and some of the repercussions of that very vibrant, very an energized kind of core economy. And that's when he's come out with his latest book, The New Urban Crisis, with the subtitle, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. And so for today, we've got a great hour interview with Richard Florida. So thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Peter. The one thing I will say is that subtitle is too long, but I wanted to shrink it. Well, actually, I didn't want a subtitle, but they told me I needed one. So thank you for reading that overly long double subtitle. Appreciate it. I've
What's
always
nice about it, what's nice about though, is it really gets to the key issues that I think you're exploring there,
yeah.
which is
Well, that's what they said, but I'm like, 3 words. The new urban crisis, or actually 4 words, is too much for me. So,
a
but
hashtag.
thanks
It has to fit in a hashtag somehow. It's figured
for that exactly,
out.
and make sure you have M dash in there too, not just a comma. Makes for a good subtitle.
Well, there's a lot to go over here because you're actually touching on a lot of the themes that we're really preoccupied with in this series and have been exploring with dozens of other interviews in the past year. So the first way I kind of want to get at this is we've been talking about and looking at the surprising kind of revitalization of cities. I mean, early in my lifetime, everyone was leaving the core cities, and when I was a young journalist, we were all looking at the rotting urban cores and trying to figure out what to do about it. And now the opposite has happened. So besides just the demographics of it, which a lot of people track, you really see it as central to the evolution of the economy. And do you want to just kind of talk a little bit about what is behind this kind of supercharging of the cores of cities right now?
Yeah, well, I think my life mirrors your experience. As I say in the book, I was born in 1957 in Newark, New Jersey, back when Newark, and now we're basically at the 50th anniversary of the riots. So back when Newark was a functional, desirable, economically thriving city, my dad worked in a factory in the ironbound section. My entire extended family, I'm Italian American, so on both sides, everyone lived there. Um, and we would go to the downtown department stores. If I remember correctly, there was Bamberger's, there was a Haynes, there was a Kresge's, and all sorts of related shops. And then, as the 60s progressed, as I got a little older, the city started to decline. And, I remember, I tell the story in the book of, being with my dad. It must have been, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, something like that, 10 days ago from when we are talking, maybe not when you guys are watching this, when Peter and I are talking here, that Newark exploded into riots. So we were driving. My dad wanted me to learn how to play a musical instrument. I wanted to be like Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton. My dad liked jazz. He wanted me to learn music. He was taking me to a guitar lesson. Of course, Peter, he had to be an Italian American jazz guitar teacher. And that my dad's like, get down on the seat, get down on the seat, get down on the floor. And there were guns firing and shots and tanks rolling through the streets and armored vehicles. And Newark was in riots. So then the city, just my city, and I'm a working class kid. We didn't have much money. The only city I knew was Newark. It emptied out. And I guess I thought that is what happened to cities, as a kid growing up at the time. And I think it really imprinted itself on my brain. So, of course, by the time I got to college and certainly to graduate school, and I went to graduate school at Columbia, you could see the beginnings of an urban revival. Although it was very small scale, it was limited to certain bohemian neighborhoods or, countercultural neighborhoods. It was in lower Manhattan, in the Village, in Soho, and so on and so forth. And then, in Pittsburgh, I began to confront the thing that led me to write the book you mentioned very kindly, Rise of the Creative Class. I confronted the fact that, Pittsburgh had all the prerequisites of being a great technology hub, a great university, Carnegie Mellon, where I taught, great faculty, great researchers, doing research at the time, right, on self-driving cars. I could see that they were self-driving tanks, but they were driving around the parking lot on robots and robots that would serve human beings. All the things, the internet search, all these things were just stuff that people at Carnegie Mellon did. But of course, all of those technologies were rooting in the Bay Area where you are, in the greater Boston area, around Austin, Texas, around Seattle. And so I really got interested in the urban revival. And, I wrote that book in 2000. Oh, I wrote it in the late 1990s and the early 2000s and published it in 2002. And I think to make a long story somewhat shorter, what struck me in the intervening decade and a half is that I would have never predicted the extent of the urban revival. You mentioned that you're talking to me from the Mission District. I could have never expected the Mission District and parts of downtown San Francisco to have this kind of revival on steroids. Lower Manhattan, Tribeca, Soho, Chelsea, Hell's Kitchen, to see big towers arising on Hudson Yards, to see a High Line Park where there was a old dead rail line. I think to see Brooklyn and the Brooklyn waterfront revitalized, and I could go on to see Pittsburgh come back in Detroit. It really surprised me. And I think over the past decade, I really became increasingly interested in the growing inequity that was part and parcel of the urban revival, and not just the growing inequity of our cities, but the growing inequity of our geography broadly. And I think that's what really motivated me to write this book about the new urban crisis.
Okay, so we've got a good thing happening with these cities reviving and energized and new investment and young people and all kinds of things happening, but there are this negative repercussions. So talk about what you're laying out here as the new urban crisis, because. And I just want to frame it a little bit. Is in the book, you use things like, it's the central crisis of our times. It's, a turning point in American history. And you see this as not just, yet another issue we got to deal with, but you're talking about it as a fundamental thing that's happening here in our cities. So
Sure.
Give a little bit more of the context of that. This isn't just collateral damage. There's something fundamental going on in the nature of our economy and what's happening in these urban centers that we really got to confront in a big way.
Sure. Well, the old urban crisis was really the crisis of the center city and of people and jobs, companies moving to the suburbs. So in a sense, the middle fell out of the center city, the middle class left, the jobs left, and the center city became what was called at the time, which my professors called the hole in the donut. There was a hole there as everything vacated to the suburbs. The new urban crisis is quite different because it is partly a crisis of success. It is partly a crisis of the urban revival itself, as you mentioned. But I think there are 3 or 4 dimensions that I try to sort through in the book that are worth repeating. And then I want to get to why I think this is the central crisis of capitalism and represents a very big political contradiction, certainly of American capitalism, and capitalism in the Bay Area and greater New York and knowledge hubs like Boston and DC and Seattle and so on. The first dimension is the rise of what I call winner-take-all urbanism, where there are a very small group of cities and metropolitan areas. The San Francisco Bay Area surely would be one. The second would be the greater New York City area, Los Angeles, Boston, Seattle, Washington, DC, and more. And certainly a few more than that if we look globally, London and Paris and Berlin and Shanghai. And I go through a systematic effort to identify those in the book. But basically these winners, just like, we have a winner-take-all economy and a winner-take-all celebrity economy and winner-take-all CEO economy, these winners get the lion's share of talent, the lion's share of economic assets, the lion's share of technology, finance, media, entertainment industries. And places like New York and London and San Francisco and LA have just grown their shares of all those things. So the second dimension is that, and that is creating a kind of gaping geographic inequality between these centers. If I was a right-wing person or a populist, I would call them of the urban elite and the rest of the country. And as I mentioned in the book, it is that gaping geographic inequality that has produced the backlash that gave us, quite terrifyingly, Donald Trump and Trumpist kind of populism. The second dimension is that the winners don't come out of this unscathed. In fact, they are very deeply scathed, because guess where inequality, economic segregation, the decline of the middle class has been the largest? In the most vibrant, the most advanced, the most affluent, the densest, the most technologically innovative, the most high tech, the most well educated cities and metros. So, atop the list on the new urban crisis stand the same places: San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, and so on. So the winners have this growing crisis of success. The third dimension is, of course, what I call the crisis of the suburbs. It is not only that the urban crisis affects the center city, but as the affluent top 10% of our economy have moved back to great cities like San Francisco and New York, the bottom 10% of our income distribution has been pushed out of cities. And where do they go? Well, of their neighborhoods. Some go to other relatively disadvantaged urban neighborhoods, but a large share of them go into the old, close by, distressed working class suburbs. So the rate of suburban poverty is, we have more poor people in suburbs than cities. The rate of suburban poverty is growing faster than it is in cities. If you're a poor person, it's harder to subsist in a suburb because the kinds of services you need aren't there. And all sorts of other crime and violence, the opioid epidemic, violent crime increasing in cities. We could go meth houses, all of this. And I talked about several other dimensions, but the one I want to highlight here, because just we want to be reasonable with time, is that if the old urban crisis was the decline of the middle class in cities, the new urban crisis is about the decline of the middle class across the board. And so in the United States in the year 1970, about 70% of Americans lived in middle class neighborhoods, and today about 40% do. In 220 or 209 of 222 metros for which the Pew Research Center has collected this data, we've seen the middle class in their neighborhoods decline. So, and the political point I wanted to make is that this leads to two political reactions, which I think not only make this an economic crisis, but a political crisis. The first one I mentioned is that this rising geographic inequality between the winners and the rest sows the seeds of a very nativistic, xenophobic, racist, and sexist restoration movement, which we call populism. It is not that Trump is attracting necessarily poor white people or the working class, maybe. What he is attracting is people who are turned off by the values of these urban centers, the values of tolerance, open-mindedness, including women, minorities, gay and lesbian people. They want to return to what they consider traditional American values. And a friend of mine said something very interesting, Canadian friend of mine who's interviewed people all throughout the heartland, said they don't think of themselves, Richard, as working class Trump supporters. They think of themselves as the real Americans. Process that for a while. They think of themselves as the real Americans, while the people who live in the cities are not the real Americans, and they're the threat to Americanism. And that's been borne out in a whole variety of research I talk about in the book. But on the flip side, we are now getting, and what I find equally troubling, and you see it in San Francisco with the protests against high-tech shuttle buses, with the protests against tech-led gentrification. This has happened in London, where the protests are escalating over our tech companies and gentrification. You now see a movement on the left to blame tech companies for the problems of these cities. And you see a growing movement to say, tech companies are a big part of the problem. I recently read an interview with Cory Booker, the person I admire, for a Newarker like me, a guy who gave me the Newark Medal of Honor, where he's saying tech companies are a big part of the problem in America. They better get with it. And I was talking to one of your Congress people from the Bay Area, and he said, Richard, the pitchforks are out. So I think on both sides, there's this right-wing reaction, but from the left, there is this reaction that is in many ways as troubling, which is saying tech companies are to blame for the problems of American society. And what I say in the book is that really worries me, because tech companies are key to generating the innovations, the technologies, creating the jobs. In American history, financial companies may have been the devil before. Big monopolistic industrial companies may have been the devil before. But Americans have always kind of liked innovators. So one thing that worries me is these joint backlashes. This backlash from the right against progressive, forward-looking values, and the backlash in the left against the tech companies. And in the book, I say we need a way out of that. And we need to make a more inclusive urbanism. And that will be where we have to get to.
So before we go into that, because I definitely want to get into some of these pieces of that, let's go a little bit deeper, because I mean, we're sitting in San Francisco, and it's the same thing, a very progressive city where it's the left that is flipping out about so many of the things happening in the Bay Area here, that from a distance would seen as good things, new jobs, new innovation, new buildings, wealth spreading, but it's spreading in good ways too, and philanthropies and all kinds of stuff happening. What is behind? Is it an ideological thing, or is it a misunderstanding of what's really going on? Because you, for example, mentioned how you think gentrification is kind of overblown in your book, which I'd like to also kind of get to reference it, that it's not really happening to this degree. So is it scapegoating? Is it kind of old thinking? Or I'm just curious, what is going on there really in that respect?
Well, all of the above. I mean, the problems of rising inequality in urban centers like San Francisco are real. But I identified this back in 2003 in an article for the Washington Monthly, that the Bay Area and New York and these places had the highest levels of wage inequality in the country. The backlash against gentrification has been going on in places like and displacement has been going on in places like San Francisco for the past 40 or 50 years. But I think more recently, tech companies never located in cities before. They located out in suburban corporate complexes and office parks, then the so-called nerdistans, where engineers with their pocket protectors and fancy calculators and computers could drive their souped-up cars to work and never deal with the kind of hurly-burly problems of urban centers. But of course, we know as urbanists that innovation is a product not just of the accumulation of knowledge, or not just of great universities, not just of talented inventors. All of those things are important, of course. It happens, as Jane Jacobs, the great urbanist, told us 50 years ago. Innovation and entrepreneurship and startup companies tend to happen in the densest urban centers. So it's not a surprise to me that over the past decade or decade and a half, high-tech companies, and especially startup companies, have migrated back to urban centers. So, I took a very detailed look at this. I think we're the only group that's ever looked at this at the zip code level. Now more than half of all technology startups, and maybe 60% of the venture capital investment in those technology startups, is occurring in urban neighborhoods like the one you're sitting in the Mission District, like other parts of downtown San Francisco, like parts of lower Manhattan, and also places like Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and downtown Seattle. And these are the places where people want to be. Talented, creative, knowledgeable people want to be in those places. So that's where companies are going. I think out of that, given the fact that these places are more unequal, housing is less affordable, it's pretty natural to start to point fingers. And to point fingers at the big bad technology companies is relatively easy to do. Now, in the book, I point out that there's very little evidence, very, very little evidence that tech companies, there is evidence that links the tech companies and their presence and concentration to rising housing prices. There is very little, if any, evidence that links tech companies to growing inequality. There are other characteristics of those cities. The fact that they're expensive, the fact that they attract lots of educated people, the fact that they haven't built enough housing, we could go on and on. But it's hard to pin the blame on rising inequality and segregation on tech companies. That said, they are being blamed. And so I think to this point, to be quite honest, Peter, I think the tech community said, Hillary Clinton's going to win. We'll support her and she's going to win. The Democrats are going to win. Obama was in office. That's something the federal government will take care of. Or if not in California, Jerry Brown will take care of it. Or in New York, Andrew Cuomo will take care of it. I think the rise of Trump and the backlash against this is a big wake-up call. And I guess it doesn't matter whether or not tech companies are the immediate cause. They are increasingly being blamed. And so I've been writing a lot on this more recently, on how tech companies, along with other anchor institutions, universities, medical centers, real estate developers, have really got to become part of a more inclusive prosperity. And it's in their interest to do so. So to me, it makes no sense to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It would hurt the urban revival to sort of say, we want to put a moratorium on tech companies coming to great cities. And moreover, it would damage our innovative prowess. I call this in the book a kind of new urban Luddism. If we can't get densely clustered tech companies in our country, we're going to damage our innovative prowess. So now I think it's up to tech companies, universities, medical centers, local governments, real estate developers to band together, because there is going to be no federal help to provide affordable housing or to combat inequality. We're going to have to do that locally, and we're going to have to engage our own models of building more inclusive prosperity together.
Awesome, and that's a good. Let's just hold that before we get into some of the policy things there. But I love that kind of framing. Can we go one? Let's go one more notch from tech companies to the sharing economy, because again, because that's another interesting one where one way to frame the sharing of underutilized assets is in dense cities is a good thing. It's kind of a solution to what's going on here. Yet they're often seen now as, maybe they're just part of the broader tech backlash, but I'm just wondering, to your extent, how do you see the sharing economy and the companies within that, Uber, Airbnb, and those others, fitting in this kind of situation? Pros and cons.
Well, I think in a way it all fits together in that all of these things are part of a fundamental transformation in the nature of capitalism. The old industrial capitalism was pretty easy to understand, although it took us a couple of 100 years to come to grips with it and make it work for us. Remember, the old industrial capitalism was driven by class conflict, civil war in the United States fought between the industrial South and the industrial North and the rural South, plantation-based South. Major depressions, in the 19th century and 20th century, much worse than what we were able to manage our way through more recently. 2 world wars, the rise of all of the isms, totalitarianism, communism, fascism, and all of that. So this transformation, I think I would submit, is even bigger, because we're now moving for the first time from a natural resource and physical labor economy to an economy that is motivated by the human mind, human knowledge, human creativity. So the transformation is leaving certain parts of the country behind, and advantaging certain smaller parts of the country on the coast, like the Bay Area, the East Coast, the Acela Corridor. But it's also transforming cities. And if I said this a long time ago in Rise of the Creative Class, no one paid attention. I say it again in this book. If the factory was the arena of class conflict for the industrial age, for the arena of capital accumulation and economic growth, and the factory and the corporation, the city is the arena for innovation, economic progress, and class conflict today. So that's what we're seeing played out. There is this battle for very limited urban space. And in that, tech companies have been painted tarred with that brush, some for very good reasons, some for not very good reasons. But the sharing economy, which on the one hand, as you said, is a really important part of making cities efficient. There was a time when our farms were incredibly inefficient and it took 80% of our population to make the stuff we eat. Then we made our farms really effective and we, revolutionized agriculture. Now we make enough food to feed ourselves plus with 1% of our workforce. There was a time when our factories were extremely inefficient and it took more than 50% of our workforce to work in factories. But now with the assembly line and modern Taylorism and scientific management, and then the Japanese production system and quality manufacturing and lean production, we now use 5 or 6% of our workforce to make all of these manufactured goods. One of the last arenas of inefficiency in our economy is a city. The lights are on, the housing isn't used, the cars stay parked. We have all these fixed assets which are barely used. Office buildings go empty, houses where people aren't home. And so the sharing economy, such that it is, it seems to me a way to take that city as a platform for innovation and economic growth and make it more efficient. But of course, it generates its own backlash because, and of course, some of the firms have not played their hands the best they can. They cause all sorts of trouble for themselves. But the point of fact is that then Uber gets blamed for driving cabs out of business. When Uber is away, or the ride-sharing services are away, to make the economy run more efficiently and to cause us as individuals to not have to own a car. In fact, I told my wife recently that the last car we bought will be the last car we ever buy. Just not worth it to own a car anymore. Sharing of hotel spaces, living spaces, all of that part of the sharing economy. So I think it's a natural tendency, but yes, I think the backlash against this has been the sharing economy is causing our problems and technology companies are causing our problems. And to my mind, that puts the burden back on these companies to say, no, 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 we're not going to be the cause of your problem. We're going to work to find a solution. And the way we're going to find a solution is to work together to try to lessen these inequities and divides and try to make our cities better and more inclusive places. And I think finally now we're getting to that place. Finally, we're getting to the place, and maybe this is where we got in the Depression, when people like Henry Ford said, we've got to start to pay workers a $5 a day so they can buy the damn cars. Maybe it's the part we got in the Great Depression when retail magnates like Lincoln Filene or Filene's department stores in New England said, you know what, we've got to do something in the government to raise people's wages and to give them some kind of security and safety net, because by God, they got to buy stuff and we have to build a middle class. Maybe that's the wake-up call we're having today. But certainly, I think with the combination of the right backlash and the left backlash, tech companies, which are very important for our innovative future, are going to have to be part of the solution and be poised, if nothing else, as more part of the solution than part of the problem.
I love that frame, and I share it. And others I know, like, I don't know if you know John Battelle and others are trying to reframe this too from New Coast Shift. I love that frame. What's interesting about this, a couple things that are interesting that seem to be historically different than in the past is, often we've seen these giant, in the past eras, the companies that were ascendant or dominant took outside pushback, Standard Oil, you had to be cracked up, or workers' movements to kind of grind out the kind of gains in the post-war world and things like that. You've now got literally the 5 biggest companies in the world now are all tech companies. They're all on the West Coast here with a lot more running room ahead of them. I mean, if you look at the numbers here, do you see any evidence that there might be a magnanimity, a kind of almost like a voluntary kind of, let's solve this differently? Or do you think it's going to take the kind of, beyond even just this initial backlash, some kind of really outside pressure, federal government, workers, whatever it is, that's going to crack at it? I mean, my feeling is that there's a lot of goodwill there that could actually be leveraged, but I'm just curious where you fall on that kind of scale.
Well, I think there's a couple things that work in the favor of making this work for us rather than against us. One is that the cities in which tech companies are located are by far the most politically progressive places in the United States. By U.S. standards, a place like San Francisco or Boston or Seattle or New York, the Bay Area had the largest share. The Bay Area, that's the San Francisco Metro and the San Jose Metro, had the largest share of votes of any large metro for Mrs. Clinton and the smallest share of votes for Donald Trump. So that tells me, and New York was also high, and Boston was also high, and Seattle, that tells me that the places where this new economy or knowledge economy or creative economy has nestled are among the most progressive parts of our society. Secondly, taking my own rubric, the creative class, if you look at votes for liberal politicians, identification as a political liberal, left on the American political spectrum, votes for whether it's President Obama or presidential candidate Clinton, and against Republicans or against Trump, the creative class is highly and positively associated with votes for liberalism, votes for candidates like Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Obama. So that will put pressure on local governments. And of course, you see this in San Francisco. You see it in New York with Bill de Blasio winning the mayoralty on a campaign about the tale of two cities and providing affordable housing. You see it very clearly with Anne Hidalgo in Paris. You see it with Sadiq Khan, the remarkable mayor in London. Big cities like San Francisco are different from gated suburbs. They have rich people and poor people and ethnic diversity and diversity by sexual orientation. And not everyone can wall themselves off in a giant condominium. These are real places that have political contestation. So my hunch is the first things will start to happen at the local level. And that will involve both cajoling and conversation, but also probably some political action to say to these large tech companies that are doing many good things, innovating, generating jobs, buck up, guys. And I'm hearing it from, as I mentioned before, from liberal politicians. The pitchforks are coming out. Get with the program before it gets too bad. There's lots of things tech companies can do to help here. One, I talked about the rise of inclusionary prosperity. They can start to provide workforce housing and affordable housing on and around their campuses. It's not a hard thing to do. They're very rich, very wealthy, lots of money. They can provide workforce housing for their service workers, the people who work in their cafeterias and in their healthcare centers and daycare center and gymnasiums. Two, they can make those jobs better. I mean, who knows better how to make knowledge work a great job than a Google, than an Amazon, than a Microsoft, than an Apple? Why tolerate this divide where the service workers who are running the daycare centers, running the cafeterias, are paid minimum wage, and those jobs are outsourced to outsourced providers, and the workers are treated like crap? We know from research that's been done at MIT, from the same people who looked at the upgrading of manufacturing and lean manufacturing, that when you treat workers well, when you pay them more, when you engage them in their work, they provide better service, they're more innovative, they come up with novel ways to solve problems. Just like we made manufacturing work better, we can make service work better. They can make sure the tenants that come in to be part of their corporate complexes also provide good jobs rather than bad jobs. So they can begin to help support transit. I mean, people think the shuttle buses are selfish because they are. Um, Transit is something that people can share, and we see this now. The new Google project in San Jose, which is very interesting test case. Will they do affordable housing? Will they upgrade service work? And there's pressure for them to do so. But locating around a transit hub and providing financial support for that transit hub, I think there's lots that these five big tech companies can do. And I do think it could be part of a progressive moment. I think that the interests of tech companies and their creative class knowledge workers and service workers are much more aligned than the interests of, say, the coalition of restoration that supports Donald Trump. So and I've been writing about this, that the natural coalition that would lie behind a progressive solution is tech companies, tech and knowledge workers, and the service workers. Lord knows if we don't do that, Peter, holy shit, to turn a phrase, the thought of America falling victim to this kind of Trumpist backlash in anything more than the very possible shortest term is terrifying, because this could be the first time in American history that America turns its back on immigration, on openness, on technological innovation, on urbanism in a significant way. And if that happens, I think there goes everything. That America will over time cease to become the center of these technology companies, the center of this innovation revolution, and it will cede its position to other places. So, Lord God, I hope it happens.
Completely agree with that. One last thought on that, and then I want to get to this agenda a little bit more. But you mentioned San Francisco, obviously, and then LA occurs a lot in your book. And given that the politics of California have kind of gotten beyond conservative republicanism, they've been so marginalized over the last couple decades here. One frame is that what's happened in California here is essentially the early demographics, the early shifts that are coming to America writ large. I'm just wondering if you see anything special going on in California as a state, or the entire kind of state as an incubator in this Trump kind of period to kind of really come up with a broader progressive politics beyond even just the urban core stuff.
I think our country's divided. And I think there are places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and California, and there aren't many of them remaining, New York and Boston, New York State and Massachusetts and Washington, Seattle and Washington. But much of the rest of the country is becoming redder and redder and angrier and angrier. I made the maps. We made the three-dimensional maps. You can see them on my stuff on City Lab. Those spikes of blue, which may have carried millions more votes for Mrs. Clinton, are by far a losing geography. When you factor in the Electoral College, it's going to be hard to see how Electoral College is going to be hard to win. And then when you look at what's happening, if you think Trump's bad, in the state governments and the state legislatures, in Texas, the business community is apoplectic about this attempt to ban trans people from bathrooms. In North Carolina, the retreat on gay and lesbian rights has got the business community up in arms. So what we're likely to see in the short run is a migration of technology and talent to the few blue safe places that are left, as particularly as states try to preempt, as Texas tries to preempt what's happening in Austin, as North Carolina tries to preempt what's happening in the Research Triangle, and go on. So these little specks of blue that are sprinkled around the country are likely to shrink. Um, I think California and New York and Massachusetts are really different. Now, and here's the big aha moment that I had in finishing the book after the election. I don't want to impugn Red America. Red America is entitled to its beliefs, even if it's not my beliefs. If people want to live in a way with more family values in a more traditional America and don't want to invest in transit and don't want to invest in better schools and better educational systems, so be it. They're entitled to that. If we in Blue America want to invest in better universities and transit and have open arms for immigrants and the gay and lesbian people, we should be able to do that. And I think we really do have two different countries. And maybe the only way out in the short run, I say this in the book, is to lessen the stakes in these every 4 to 8 year soft civil war like political contests, which pit the country against itself, blue and red America, and say to people, we're going to give the power back to you. If you want to live in a blue city, that's fine. If you want to live in a red state, that's fine. We're not going to tell you which way to live. We're going to give you the ability to run your place the way you want. We're going to let you keep your money. You don't have to send all this money to Washington. Keep it locally. One thing that that crosses my mind more than once is not that California is going to change the country, but the country is going to be more and more against California. And in that sense, I look to the situation in Canada. And what shaped modern Canada was the rise of a secessionist movement in Quebec. And that secessionist movement was about language and the French language. But my idol, Jane Jacobs, wrote a book on this. No one's ever read. They read The Death and Life of Great American Cities and the Economy of Cities. And she said she supported Quebec secessionism on the grounds of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity means that those who live in a place, those who live in a province or a state or a locality or neighborhood know best and should have the most possible power. It just may be time for places like California to say, screw it, we'll secede. Now, I'm not saying that seriously. I don't believe California should secede. But if New York and California and Massachusetts and Washington said, you know what, we've fed up with this bullshit. We want to secede because we want to live our lives and run our economies on our own terms. And if these, I don't know, how many, 300 cities now that signed on to the climate change accords and said, you know what, we're just sick and tired of this bullshit. We want to run ourselves our own way, and we're bipartisan. We're a bipartisan coalition of mayors. It might be able to create enough of a political movement to say that we recognize that blue and red America are different. We don't want to impose our will on either one. We want to let California run its economy the way it wants, and Arizona and Mississippi and wherever, Missouri, to run the economies the way they want. So I think that's where we are in this country. And I fear that maybe in the long, long run, the country looks more like California. But over the course of my life, this divide has gotten worse and the forces of reaction have gotten stronger. So I don't want to bet on that. I'd rather bet on a country where places like San Francisco and New York and California and Massachusetts and Washington State can run their own economies the way they see fit.
That's interesting. We'll get to a global piece here but before we go too much further, let's talk about this urbanism for all that you've kind of laid out there. So let's say there is some kind of progressive revival centered on cities in these blue areas, for example. You came up with a really intriguing list of some of the things to do, and again, we're having this conversation when the Democrats just came out with their kind of their platform, let's just say, for change, better jobs or the better deal thing. But you have a much more transformational kind of agenda there, and structural, and you talk about it as a watershed moment in the country. You talk about it as it's now or never. It's like, give us a sense of some of the level of what you're proposing there, and the kind of pieces that would, I think, make a really compelling kind of agenda, honestly, but ones that aren't really being articulated right now.
So I think the moving force for this will be mayors. And I got the great good fortune to go and address the U.S. Conference of Mayors in June about this. And the response that I got from mayors, um, from cities, Republican mayors and Democratic mayors, was we have to do this. So, um, but I want to add that I also was recently invited in the past several weeks to go visit the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives, not the Senate. And I noticed Chuck Schumer announced the better deal, which is wonderful. But I was invited by the leadership in the House of Representatives. The person who invited me was a Bay Area congressperson, Congressman DeSaulnier. But I met with Congressman DeFazio and many members of the California delegation. Very interesting. The principal actors that I met with were mainly the California delegation, organized by Representative DeSaulnier, but also people from the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, and Washington, and a few others. But it was very much a West Coast group. They totally got this. They totally saw this. And in a way, it gave me great hope at a time that I'm not very optimistic that there was a national political force that could link to mayors. But here are the principles which about this movement to urbanism for all or inclusive prosperity. One, we've got to solve the housing problem. And the housing problem is simply that we're not building enough in the places that need housing to be built. So, one part of this has to be that we get rid of these NIMBYistic zoning and building codes, which hold back development in places like San Francisco. No brainer. Lots of agreement on that from across the political spectrum. But, big but, getting rid of housing and building codes and land use right now today, everyone sort of believes, and maybe it's the triumph of this kind of right-wing mentality, conservative mentality, if we just have deregulation, everything fixes itself. Well, no. What's tended to happen is when we've relaxed zoning and building codes, we get more luxury housing for rich people. Some of it with no people in it, some of it empty most of the time where they stash money. So we need a commitment to affordable housing. And there we talked previously about localities are going to have to mandate that developers who want to make a killing or tech companies that are going to build and others provide that affordable housing or pay taxes to provide that affordable housing. We have to completely change our national housing system. We have to stop subsidizing rich people who own homes with a mortgage interest tax deduction. Then we have to put that money into affordable rental housing. I talk in the book about infrastructure. Donald Trump says he cares about.
Before you go to the infrastructure, because the thing that was really interesting about the housing was a land value tax as opposed to property tax. Could you explain that? Because that to me was really interesting.
And there's growing support for this. I mean, it's something that has bipartisan support. So right now we tax and we create revenues for localities based on the property tax. So basically, you pay tax on the value of your property, which is the more valuable your property gets, the more tax you pay. So you'll notice even in great cities like San Francisco, New York, where land is really valuable, there'll be surface parking lots. And in fact, in some cities, surface parking lots, people say, are the most valuable real estate, where people park cars and it appreciates in value. But it appreciates in value, but you pay a low tax because there's nothing on it, a bunch of surface parking spots. Or you get this reaction where people are saying, I got mine, Jack. I live in a great neighborhood of low-rise housing. I don't want taller housing to go up around me because it's going to somehow negatively impact my property values. I want to keep things the way they are, not in my backyard. So the land value tax turns the tables on that and basically says your tax rate goes down the more intensively developed the land is. And the guy who invented this was a guy from San Francisco who lived in San Francisco, Henry George. And he invented this idea like 150 years ago, where he was saying, the problem is people are sitting on these plots of agricultural land and they're not developing them. What if we tax in a way that creates an incentive for development? So the more developed the land was, the more mixed use, the more residential, commercial, industrial, the more densely developed, the lower the tax would be. And the idea would be that in combination with other things stimulates more development. So it's an idea that has a lot of support on the left and right. And it's something cities, it's not something the national governments need to do. That's something that cities can begin to experiment with themselves.
That's fascinating. And you've now inspired me to go deeper into that with some more work on that. But so your overall urbanism for all. We can't go through everything, but the affordable housing, the infrastructure bill. I cut you off right before you were going that, but give some broad.
We need to shift our infrastructure away from roads into transit, and obviously the federal government isn't going to do that. So we're going to need coalitions of people, private sector, tech companies, universities, hospitals, local actors, state actors that say, look, we got to build that high-speed rail link. Well, they're doing it in South Florida between Miami and Orlando, but we've got to do it in California. We've got to get this thing built, and the federal government's not going to help us or help us as much. So it's going to have to be done on a region-wide basis, maybe across states, as coalitions of states. And then we have to upgrade these jobs. And, I talked about that before, but manufacturing job wasn't a good job to begin with. It was a crappy job. My father told me it took 9 people in his family to make a family wage during the Depression. He worked in a factory. My granddad worked in a factory. His brother worked in a factory. My grandmother worked in a bakery, and his sisters did all sorts of clerical and office work. Came back from the war after he served in World War II, and as if by magic, his factory job in the same eyeglass factory was transformed into a good job. There wasn't magic. We had the Wagner Act, which gave workers the rights to unionize and bargain collectively. We had the New Deal. We had the creation of the welfare state, social safety net. And that whole complex of factors turned bad jobs into good jobs. Right now, 33% of Americans work in good knowledge jobs. Another 20% of Americans work in factory jobs, or not factory jobs, construction jobs and transportation jobs, blue-collar jobs. Almost half of Americans, between 45 and 50%, depending on how you estimate and where you live, work in low-wage routine service jobs, preparing food, working in retail shops, taking care of people, daycare centers, home health care, the caring professions. Those people make 20, 25 grand a year. They're largely women. They're largely immigrants. They're largely ethnic and racial minorities. We cannot condemn half of our workforce, 65 million plus Americans, to crappy jobs. And so a big part of this agenda has to be making those jobs better. We need higher minimum wages. We need higher minimum wages tied to local living and cost of living conditions. We need the private sector, with tech companies in the lead, have to take the lead in showing how to upgrade these jobs. And the political reality is that this is the class group that's not organized. If you want to build a progressive coalition in America, the working class and the working class locations are squarely in the Republican camp. Sorry. For the Democrats who so badly want to get them back. And what really concerns me there is just the effect Trump is having in pushing the whole system to the right. We have to go get them back, and we have to be nice to them and forget immigration, and we have to get the white working class back. The white working class and its locations are pretty squarely in the Republican camp. But those 65 million Americans who are service workers are in nobody's camp. They are the group that turned out for Obama and didn't turn out for Mrs. Clinton. They are the women-headed families, the minorities, the immigrants, people living and not making it who feel really abandoned. And boy, oh boy, to be able to build a cross-class coalition, an economic agenda that says we're going to improve those jobs, and a cross-class coalition that would say we could put the knowledge workers and the creative class and the service class together in a broad New Deal coalition for an urbanism for all, for an inclusive prosperity for our country. That could be a big deal.
All right, we're getting towards the towards the end of this, what's been being a fascinating interview here. But there's a couple pieces I wanted to just raise here, because preoccupation of this series, there's been a couple preoccupations in this series for this year. We've done this for 2 years now. And one is we're trying to look globally more, because we've been spending all our time in the American context here for good reason, and it's been super compelling. But when you talked about the kind of decentralization of, the country into cities or states, it kind of made me think globally, because this is, again, it's not an American phenomenon. This is happening globally, and there's an you go into it in your book, which is a whole other world out there too. That this urban concentration is happening. It's a global phenom. It's the 21st century phenom. We're not alone in this stuff. So talk a little bit about the global dimension here, I think, just before we have about 10 minutes here.
Sure.
So
let me take it at the mundane and the proximate level first, and then scale out.
Okay.
There are people in America now talking a lot about the rise of the rest. San Francisco has become expensive. It's hard to live in. Tech companies are paying a lot for workers. New York is the same. And, San Francisco Bay Area has increased its share of venture capital-backed startups from about 20% in 1995 to almost half. So the rest hasn't risen yet. And that New York and the Acela corridor, the Boston, New York, Washington corridor, and the Bay Area and Los Angeles are where the majority, and Seattle, are where the majority of our tech startups are, more than 2/3. But yet people are saying, well, we're going to get the rise of the rest. Pittsburgh's coming back, Detroit's coming back, Nashville, and there's some truth to that. Omaha, Denver. You know where I think the rise of the rest is going to happen? And I'm talking to you from there right now. The rise of the rest, if it happens, is going to jump the freaking border. And the rest that's going to rise are called Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Why? Because Toronto and Montreal are closer to New York and Boston than Chicago is. And Vancouver is a hop, skip, and a jump away from Seattle. If Trump clamps down on immigration, tells people for certain countries, Iran and elsewhere, you can't come to the United States, and leading scientists can't get entry and go to Stanford or MIT, we're already seeing it. We're seeing the number of famous scientists, leading scientists coming to the University of Toronto or McGill or the University of British Columbia. We've seen Google open up a special laboratory for my colleague Jeffrey Hinton in Toronto because he said, I don't want to move to the Bay Area. Microsoft opened a laboratory for one of his colleagues in Montreal. Another guy in Edmonton, of all places, has got a lab. But Toronto and Vancouver typically rank among the best places to live in the world. They have great international airports. They have vibrant tech ecosystems that are on par with Austin, maybe not quite Seattle yet, but pretty big and vibrant, and they're growing. They have great universities. They have great medical centers. They don't have violence. They have great places to live. As I said, they typically top the list of the world's best places to live. So I think one short-term thing might be, internationally, that we see the rise of Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal, the rise of the rest. San Francisco and New York will still be first tier, but also London and Berlin and Paris and Amsterdam. But the second point of this is a kind of bigger point. The forces of transformation around the world are no longer nation states and prime ministers and presidents. In fact, you could argue that the nation states have become bloated and dysfunctional and suck up too much resources and are a big part of the problem. And Trump may just be the wake-up call. It may be that when you had Obama running the show, it wasn't so worrisome. But when you have a complete and total buffoon running the show, it's like, oh, God, look how dangerous, And I say, in a country of 350 million people, 350 metros, 3,500 counties, thousands upon thousands of municipalities, who in their right mind would concentrate all the power in one person in one office? The same can be said of every country around the world. Who are the forces of change? Mayors, council people, local activists. So my good friend, we lost a giant, the late Ben Barber, he had undertaken to organize, Ben, who saw this 30 years ago in an essay for The Atlantic called Jihad versus McWorld, outlined the basic tension of capitalism being between the globalists, the firms and people who are connected globally, and the localists, the nationalists, the national reactions, the coalition of restoration, who felt left behind as their cities became more connected. Well, Ben's thought, he organized something like a UN for mayors. It was called the Global Parliament of Mayors. Mike Bloomberg has, of course, invested in supporting mayors. He's now created basically a school for mayors, a set of programs, innovation programs for mayors. But across the world, it seems to me that these localities, these dense urban localities led by mayors, are the real focus for change. And in one way, you could see a battle between the old decaying nation state and these up-and-coming localities and if they could band together globally, and one of the things Ben told me before he died, we met in New York before he died, he said when Trump tried to crack down on the sanctuary cities, he had gotten his global parliament of mayors, which included European and Asian cities as well as American, to agree that if Trump cut off funding, this network of cities would support the cities that got cut off. So imagine that. Imagine if you had a network of the world's global cities, Shanghai and Beijing and Mumbai and whatever, Paris and London and New York and San Francisco, and they literally became a more active political force. So I think that's where the world is likely to head. And the question really, to my mind, is how do we manage this intervening period? how do we mobilize the political action to take that power down from the national level, distribute it to the local level, and let local levels compete? I wrote a whole essay, if folks want to read it, for the Politico magazine, their most recent issue on this. And,
Yeah, that was awesome.
typically the big innovations in public policy come from the local level, not from the federal level. And, some people believe that this would be a race to the bottom. If you did this, San Francisco would want to become more like, I don't know, a city in Alabama or Mississippi. I'm not trying to, but you know what I'm saying, a red state city that had low wages and right to work rules and no rights for people. But in fact, the people who have studied this, the political scientists who studied this, once you set up a competition which is real, see a race to the top. And they see over time that cities in other parts of the world want to become more like a place that protects workers' rights and gives civil rights. So yeah. And I guess at the end of the day, even if that's not completely the case, I would rather deal with 6, 10, 20 places that are dysfunctional and retrograde than having a country like the United States run in a retrograde and dysfunctional. There's a lot of competition among cities, and there's a lot of cities, and they're not going to cost, and mayors don't have their fingers on the nuclear trigger. So I think a decentralized system like that in the long run, nationally and globally, is the one that makes the most sense. But we've got to get there. We've got to build the political forces to get there first.
Okay, final kind of area here I just want to do, which is one thing that was absent a lot from your book, or I didn't see it rise in this conversation as well, is referencing climate change or kind of the pressures of needing to move into sustainable directions. And there's a lot of people who think of cities as in that context, also almost driven by the lessened environmental impact, better use of resources, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just curious how you see, in the coming decades here, another overlay of the climate change pressures that will accelerate any of these this transformation of cities, or accelerate any of the needs to recombine cities in more dramatic and transformational ways. How do you think about that, actually?
So two reasons. The first and most obvious one is I'm not a scientist and not an expert in climate change. So that's the self-evidently obvious one. I'm much more of an expert in urban politics and economics and that. The second one is that area is pretty well covered. Mike Bloomberg's C40, the ability to bring together mayors globally, in the United States and globally, to support the Paris Accords, the fact that we now have over 300 cities signed on as opposition. When I was at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, you could see the organization of mayors around that theme. Ben Barber, who I mentioned, his most recent book is titled Cool Cities. Not to be confused with cool cities for like hipsters. Cool cities meaning, to reduce climate change and taking a leadership. It's a fantastic book, by the way. But when I was at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meetings, so one, I think this is all really important. I think it's critical, but I think the political momentum is there, and my marginal contribution would not be as great. What happened after I made my little case to the U.S. Conference of Mayors is mayor after mayor came up to me and said, you know what, Rich? What we've been doing in climate change, we need to do for inequality and job upgrading and inclusive prosperity. We need to form a working group on that. So in many ways, I was trying to open their eyes to problems that may not be equal. Maybe climate change is the most serious of all problems, but problems that require similar kinds of solutions. But at the end of the day, I actually believe that the only way we solve climate change, equity, poverty, employment, inequality, intolerance, violence, all of those problems turn on one thing: building better cities and urban areas, making cities work rather than pull apart. So I say in the book, I actually mentioned this to the UN when I was invited to address the UN, which was a kind of mind-blowing thing. The grandest of all the grand challenges we face, and there are many: climate change, equity, poverty, violence, war, militarization. Of all the grand challenges we face, the most important one is building great cities. Urbanization is the grandest of all the grand challenges because to the extent we build sustainable, inclusive, more tolerant cities, that begins to solve or help solve all of those problems. So they all of those grand challenges revolve around building a better urbanism, and what I kind of say an urbanism that works for all. So I think that's been my mission, kind of focusing attention on the local, the urban, and saying this is an urgent problem. And I think, maybe I missed, if you ask me to go back in time and to say things I missed, the two things I really missed was the extent and the propulsiveness of the urban revival. I don't think anyone, including me, and I've talked to mayor on top of mayor, academic on top of academic, anyone could have seen how big this rush would have been back to the cities in the United States and around the world. But the other one is I don't think I or anyone else really saw the extent of the backlash against it. And so now we have to build a system that not only moves forward, but in a way co-ops or deals with that backlash or figures out a way to forestall that backlash. And, my deep worry, it's funny. I'm not that worried about the world. Like living in Canada, I don't think Canada's going to go off the rails, even though it did elect the first crack mayor, Rob Ford, the populist dude. I really worry that it's not just Trump that's the problem, that America is so divided, and the forces that elected him and protect him are so fed up and so angry that they would put almost anything ahead of their country's interest. So in this sense, I think this urban crisis, this urban divide, this winner-take-all urbanism, if you will, puts us in a position that we've not found ourselves in the United States since perhaps the middle of the 19th century, when we were even more divided. And in many ways, the position that we're in the middle of the 19th century was that the advanced forces of the industrial North had a lot of economic advantage over the declining forces of the restorationist South. I'm worried now, for the first time, that the progressive and advanced sources of American society and economy and capitalism may not have the oomph, that the forces of reaction and restoration are very strong. My hope is that the progress of urbanization, of density, of urban growth will prevail. But this is a point. This could be one of those big turning points in history that if we don't act collectively and smartly, we'll get there sooner or later, somehow, someday. But as my friends in the U.S. Congress said to me, we'd really like to make that day as short as humanly possible. We'd really like to accelerate this transformation. One thing that weighed very heavily on me when I was writing this book, and I wanted to provide some level of optimism, and in fact, the people who read this book closely say it is, at the end of the day, an optimistic book. My idol and mentor, Jane Jacobs, her last book was called Dark Age Ahead. And Jane had always seen, cities and urbanism as the force pointing to a more progressive, more humanistic, a better future for people. And she saw, she foresaw many of the things that would come to light with this populist moment. I do think that many of the basic forces of urbanization, of human clustering, of people wanting to be together, of tolerance and progressivism, but this is a time where we're all going to have to work together. And as we talked about, Peter, where companies, progressive companies, if they want to see this through, are going to have to ally with progressive movements and provide the wherewithal so that the good things that are happening prevail, and that we deal with many of the bad things that have happened as a result.
Wow. Well, that is, I guess, about as good a place as we can end. I will say that looking back on the Civil War and other junctures, it was inevitable, essentially, that the northern manufacturing industrial economy, urban centers, were going to prevail over the antiquated, slave-owning kind of plantation system that was clearly not going to rise again. Don't you feel like as much as, all the energy, all the jobs, all the innovation, all the wealth, all the, I mean, at some level, there's just almost an inevitability of the way forward in this century ahead here.
Yes. In the long run, I think globally there's the inevitability of clustered, dynamic, vibrant, diverse urban capitalism will prevail. But the triumph of that, uh, the North, if you will, the triumph of the industrial era, and the building of a middle class, not an immiserated group of workers in satanic mills, that took 150 years. You know, we look back at this period in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and go, wow, it was a golden era. We forget the 150 years of hell that preceded that, of conflict and contestation and world war and workers' rights movements. So, you know, what you hope for is that you could shorten that period and shorten the backlash and get there quickly. I'm not sure, for all its advantages, and being very honest, for all of its advantages in knowledge, in universities, in energy resources, in the size of its population, I'm not sure that the United States, if it gives in to these populistic pressures, comes out of this in the kind of dominant position it could. You know, the world right now could be the United States oyster. It has more great universities and more technology hubs and great energy resources and great immigrants who want to come and work hard in America. But the divide that has been created politically really hinder and hamper it. So it would not surprise me to see places like Toronto and Vancouver or Amsterdam or wherever, London, begin to define this new epic. And in many ways, they are moving out ahead of us. You know, I can tell you about Canada, where I live. You know, the province of Ontario, which is the equivalent of the state of California, is developing a very interesting agenda for inclusive prosperity. And, you know, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in with this. In England, which is led by the Conservatives, there is a movement to empower cities and metro areas, which doesn't exist in the United States. So, look, my father always told me, Rich, don't ever count America out. You know, I lived through the Depression. I lived through World War II. I saw the mobilization. I saw how fast this country could turn on a dime. I saw it bounce back when we were technologically and militarily unprepared. I watched as those armaments came in on boats, and we infantry soldiers cheered and saw the power of America when it put itself to work. And I believe in that. But this is a time where all of us have to dig deep. And I guess just to put to wrap this up, it's where acting locally really matters, and empowering local actors, empowering mayors and councilors, empowering different kinds of cities, Houston and San Francisco and Birmingham and Detroit and Pittsburgh and Scranton and New York and Boston, to focus on and solve their own problems. That's really what we have to do. And I think if we do that, we'll be okay. But this is a big turning point in our history.
Wow. Well, we're going to have to end here, although I could keep going for a long, long time here. But a fantastic conversation here, Richard Florida.
And we have a special guest.
Special guest there. Oh, now we've got a
Pagoda. Well, Pagoda doesn't want to be in the frame.
Which unfortunately we could have had a viral cat video out of that. But anyhow, highly recommend The Urban Crisis, Richard Florida, and also that political piece, which I also saw and I thought was fantastic. Remind me of the name of that again, if people want to search for it?
I called it When Cities Rule the World, but they changed it. So I only remember my title.
I do.
Because Ben had titled his book, When Mayors Rule the World. I titled this When Cities Rule the World, to play off Ben's great insight. But I'm sure they came up with
I think it was a different title, but even so, another short way to get into it, but highly recommend the book. But anyhow, thank you so much, Richard, and hope to see you again. And maybe if you're in town, come by. Otherwise, hope to see you in another forum. But fantastic conversation.
Thanks for having me on. Bye.